So just on the question of research and sharing of information, could we have JEVA 607, please, Henry? Sorry, you haven't got it? Oh, okay, it was sent separately. I can explain what it is in any event. It was a study carried out by Bloomberg in the States. It's called A Study of the Occurrence of Various Inherited and Acquired Antigens and Antibodies in the Blood of Patients with Haemophilia who've been seen at the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. It's a 1972 study, what it appears to show is that data about patients at the Oxford Haemophilia Centre was shared with the author of the study, Bloomberg, for the purposes of the analysis that he was undertaking. And one of the interesting facts about this information is that there appear to have been punch cards for each patient of the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. And the punch card held a range of data about the patient. And this documentation that's been shared with the inquiry by a core participant seems to suggest that the punch cards themselves or the information from the punch cards may have been provided for the purposes of the study. And again, it raises issue of patient consent about information sharing. Don't worry about looking for it, Henry. So in terms of other research and trials, I've referred to a number of those in the course of the presentation today. The inquiry will come back to that at an appropriate stage in its work. I've mentioned, obviously, Dr. Ritzer's role as a central figure in UK HCDO and listed a number of the committees or working parties that he was part of. One that I haven't mentioned so far is should be found at CABO 0000195_036. You have that, Henry? And if we go to the next page, it's just an extract from what I want. Oh, if we go to page 63, please, Henry. Thank you. So we can see from this, it's headed Committee Structure and Membership. MRC is presumably the Medical Research Council. We can see there's an AIDS committee, and then there's a number of offshoots, including an Epidemiological Studies Committee. And if we go to page 64, Henry, we can see almost halfway down the page the heading Epidemiological Studies Committee. Resuming on that, we can see the members include a number of familiar names: Dr. Galbraith, Dr. Gunson, and Dr. Ritzer of the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. And then if we just go further down that page to its terms of reference, we can see the terms of reference of this particular committee or subcommittee was to review information and research on the natural history and transmission of AIDS in the UK and abroad, and in particular the evidence concerning heterosexual transmission. This should include the female partners of bisexual men, and then the spouses of haemophiliacs who are 8-TLV3 positive, and the spouses, male and female, of persons infected through blood transfusion, and then to coordinate research within the UK in this area. So this is another committee upon which Dr. Ritzer served. This is in the second half of the 1980s. We also understand that Dr. Ritzer had a long-standing relationship with the Haemophilia Society. He was at one stage a member of the Haemophilia Society's Counsel. He was a member of the Haemophilia Society's medical advisory panel from the 1970s through, it would seem likely, to the early 1990s. Although some of the key documents that we looked at in the Cardiff presentation relating to Professor Bloom during 1983 are authored by Professor Bloom, we know, for example, that at the meeting on the 8th of October 1983, when Professor Bloom addressed the Council on a meeting of the Haemophilia Society on AIDS, Dr. Ritzer was present at that meeting. The precise role he took in the meeting is unclear. So I want to turn to consider, just briefly, a handful of the themes that emerge from the individual witness statements of patients treated at the Oxford Haemophilia Centre or their relatives. I'm not going to deal with it in detail or to mention patients by names, but just to list themes which will be, I think, well known now to everybody who's been following the inquiry's history, but these are all themes that emerge from statements relating to Oxford. The first is non-receipt of information or advice as to the risks associated with treatment with blood products. A second theme which emerges from a number of the statements is the extent to which patients had placed their faith and trust in the clinicians at the Oxford Haemophilia Centre treating them. The third theme that emerges from the Oxford-related statements is the extent to which blood products, factor concentrates, were described to patients as being ground-breaking or wonder drugs, presented in highly positive terms. A fourth theme is absence of knowledge or consent, knowledge of or consent to being tested for the presence of infections. A fifth theme is belief of a number of individual witnesses that they had been involved in or enrolled in or the subject of research without their informed knowledge and consent. A sixth theme is about the manner of diagnosis or communication of diagnosis, I should say, with HIV or HCV. And associated with that, a further theme of not receiving sufficient information or advice following diagnosis, or of delay in the communication of the diagnosis. So again, common to a number of centres, but statements from individuals treated at Oxford, some have identified in their records dates of tests and then identified a delay before, in some cases quite a significant delay before those test results and the diagnosis is communicated to the patient. And then a final theme is in relation to the availability of medical records. One vivid description from the oral evidence of one witness was a widow who described feeling as though the records of her late husband had been thrown up in the air and then only some of them had been caught. And incomplete records or difficulties in obtaining records was an issue raised by a number of witnesses who gave evidence or who provided statements relating to their treatment at Oxford. So the final matter I wanted to deal with is to look at some parts of Dr. Ritzer's expert report produced for the purposes of the HIV litigation. So, Henry, it should be at HCDO 603_001. and it's a long report. We won't go into all of it. If we go to page 6, please, Henry, we see here and on the following page a number of the committees, organisations, working parties, etc., with which Dr. Ritzer was involved. I named a number of them in the course of the presentation today. If we then go, please, Henry, to page 38. I'm not going to go through the detail of this, but there's a section in his litigation report in which Dr. Ritzer describes the history of the organisation of haemophilia care in the United Kingdom, and it gives an overview of how the designation of haemophilia centres developed, and in particular it helps explain the particularly significant position occupied by Oxford, designated as a special treatment centre at an early stage. And so I won't show any particular part of it on the screen, but it provides some useful background. And then if we go to page 55, please, you will see there a brief section in the report headed "The Relative Risks of Cryoprecipitate and Large Pool Factor VIII Concentrate." And in it, Dr. Ritzer says this: with regard to the relative risks of transmission of hepatitis by cryoprecipitate and pooled factor VIII concentrate, it is generally stated that cryoprecipitate, since it is prepared from a single donor or a limited number of donors, is less likely to transmit hepatitis than factor VIII concentrate made from a large pool of donor plasma. He then goes on to say that unfortunately adequate data are not available to settle the issue. And if we go towards the bottom of this page, it says that it can be difficult to make sound comparisons between factor VIII concentrate and cryoprecipitate. And clearly, so that is an issue you will need to consider in due course. But that is Dr. Ritzer's perspective on the point. If we go then to page 60, there's a section headed Hepatitis and Hemophiliacs. And if you go 2 pages to page 62, please, Henry. Bottom paragraph, this is what Dr. Ritzer has to say. And I should say, of course, this, as I hope I made clear earlier, was a report prepared by Dr. Ritzer for the defendants in the HIV litigation. During the early to mid-1970s, I think it is fair to say that hepatitis was probably not perceived as a long-term problem in haemophiliacs. The incidence as manifest by overt jaundice seemed to be low, the clinical illness was mild and seemed self-limiting in most patients, and death from acute hepatitis seemed very uncommon. More detailed follow-up of haemophiliacs, however, during the late 1970s showed that a significant number of haemophiliacs who were clinically well had persistently abnormal tests of liver function. In particular, the blood level of certain liver enzymes were raised above the normal level, and he refers to a 1976 and a 1980 study. Liver biopsy studies of haemophiliacs with abnormal liver function tests revealed a significant number with abnormal liver histology consistent with chronic liver disease, and refers there to Manucci 75 and Spiro and Preston in 78. So again, you may wish, sir, to consider that and the material that Dr. Ritzer refers to when you are considering what was or should have been known about the serious nature of hepatitis in the course of the 1970s. If we look then at page 75, this is the concluding part of a section that's headed Response of UK Haemophilia Centre Directors to the Problem of Hepatitis and Hemophiliacs. And I just draw attention to what's under the heading CRR comment. So this is Dr. Ritzer's comment on a narrative he set out above. From its inception, the UK Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation was aware of post-transfusion hepatitis and haemophiliacs and took steps to study the problem and to be involved in the surveillance of blood products, in particular the heat-treated materials when they became available in the early 1980s. Little was known about non-A, non-B hepatitis in 1972 when commercial factor VIII concentrate became widely available, and at first the condition was thought to be mild with little in the way of long-term damage. The studies carried out on haemophiliacs in this country and abroad showed that this was not the case, and that significant numbers of haemophiliacs in time went on to develop chronic liver disease. So again, sir, you will no doubt fit that into your assessment of what was and should have been known at relevant times. If we go to the next page, please, Henry. This section of Dr. Ritzer's report is entitled Recognition of AIDS and Development of Knowledge. And if we go to the last 4 lines, we can see Dr. Ritzer saying this: by the end of 1982, it was clear that besides promiscuous homosexuals, there were other groups at risk of developing AIDS. Those included intravenous drug abusers and recipients of blood transfusions and blood products, in particular haemophiliacs. So there, a statement by Dr. Ritzer that by the end of 1982, it was clear that the groups at risk of developing AIDS included recipients of blood transfusion and blood products, in particular haemophiliacs. If we go on to page 84, under the heading CRR comment, Dr. Ritzer makes this observation: most of the early 1981 and 1982 publications on AIDS appeared in MMWR, which was an obscure journal and probably unknown to most clinicians dealing with haemophiliacs in UK. In spite of this, the UK Haemophilia Centre directors were aware of the problems by at least the 6th of September 1982, when the matter was raised at one of the reference centre directors' meetings. I cannot be certain of the circumstances, but the matter was probably raised by Dr. J. Krask, a virologist in PHLS Manchester, who may have been aware of the MMWR report. So that is Dr. Ritzer's speculation as to how the matter came to be raised on the 6th of September, that it was raised by Dr. Krask. If we go to the next page, the top of the page refers to Dr. Jane Deforge's editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine, 13th of January 83, which we've obviously looked at on more than one occasion. Can we go to CRR comment, please, Henry? This is what Dr. Ritzer says. This article is the first that I am aware of which gave such strong recommendations concerning the AIDS problem in haemophiliacs. It was noted and discussed, but made little impression on clinical practice in UK nor in USA as far as I am aware. I think this was due in part to the fact that very few haemophiliacs in USA had developed AIDS and none in UK. Also, to have changed to using cryoprecipitate on such a large scale would almost certainly have reduced the quality of treatment of bleeding episodes. It would not have been possible to continue with the home therapy programme, as cryoprecipitate is not suitable for home treatment. The perception was that with hemorrhage being the commonest cause of death, it would be unreasonable to put the patient at greater risk of hemorrhage in view of the limited information on AIDS and its long-term prognosis. The effect of switching to cryoprecipitate would have placed great stress on the blood transfusion service, as Dr. Deforge says. Also, by using cryoprecipitate prepared by local blood transfusion centres, raw material for production of factor VIII concentrate would have been diverted from plasma fractionation laboratories, with the result that research into virus-free fractions would have been slowed down. Moreover, cryoprecipitate, although carrying a reduced risk of transmitting AIDS, did carry a risk, and this presumably was increasing during 1983 and 1984 until testing for HIV in blood donors became available. So, sir, if we just go back to the previous page, Henry, we can see awareness of the article in the New England Journal. Dr. Ritzer says it was noted and discussed. Presumably, that's a reference at least to reference centre directors, and we know that, of course, from the minutes of meetings we've looked at from the London Airport Hotel meeting. Dr. Ritzer's statement, it made little impression on clinical practice, may, of course, be right, because the evidence you've heard so far suggests that at least UK, as far as UK CDO is concerned, there were no recommendations at that stage for changes in clinical practice. The reasons that are given for not changing clinical practice at all at that stage are firstly the statement that very few haemophiliacs had developed AIDS in the US and none in the UK. And you no doubt so will wish to consider whether that the adequacy of that explanation. And then various reasons are given about why a switch to cryoprecipitate would have had disadvantages. The statement beginning, the perception was that with hemorrhage being the commonest cause of death, it would be unreasonable to put the patient at greater risk of hemorrhage, may beg the question for you to answer, sir, as to whose perception, clinicians or patients. And we do not see in Dr. Ritzer's report any particular discussion of what information was or was not provided to patients throughout this period. If we move on, Henry, to page 91, there is reference there halfway down the page to a paper in the journal Science on the 20th of May 1983. It said this is an important paper, this is Dr. Ritzer's comment, and was the first to clearly describe isolation of a retrovirus which might be the cause of AIDS. But the comment then is that the authors themselves are cautious in interpreting their results.
This was the paper which gave rise to LAV.
Yes.
As what became an alternative label and eventually was recognised as the same as HTLV3.
Yes. That's right. And then there's, it's certainly one of the papers in May 1983 on that issue. If we go to page 94, you'll see a theme in the comments, sir. So here we have a reference to September 1983 and the report in MMWR. And the comment is, because this article shows the uncertainty that still existed about the cause of AIDS and highlights to some extent the confusion that existed at the time concerning the findings of Gallo and Barsanussi and whether or not the two viruses were the same. And if we go to the following page, please, Henry. September 1980. No, that's just a repetition of the same page. Sorry, the document's been poorly copied. There is a number of times in this report when Dr. Ritzer draws attention to what he says is continuing uncertainty about the cause of AIDS. If we go to page 98, and we get to the bottom half of the page, December 1983, there's reference to a letter in the Lancet about the prevalence of AIDS in West Germany. And the comment of Dr. Ritzer is there was strong epidemiological evidence by the end of 1983 that AIDS was caused by a transmissible agent, probably a virus. And then he says haemophilia experts in USA and UK, the haemophilia experts in the UK, presumably Dr. Ritzer, Professor Bloom, and other reference centre directors primarily, were recommending that several affected haemophiliacs severely affected haemophiliacs should continue to use factor VIII concentrate, as the perceived dangers of hemorrhage were greater than those of AIDS. For mildly affected patients, cryoprecipitate or DDAVP recommended. For children, cryoprecipitate recommended where practicable. And he refers to recommendations issued in the States. If we go then to page 101, reference in the bottom half of the page to an article in Nature by Robin Weiss, and the comment is below is that I think this is referring to a number of the papers, but the paper is important. This, along with the paper by Barsanussi et al., showed convincingly that a virus was the cause of AIDS. So again, the comments to some extent are a search for evidence or proof, and that's the conclusion set out at the bottom of that page. If we go to page 105, we then see reference 29th of September 1984 to an article in the Lancet which describes adding a mouse retrovirus to cryoprecipitate from which freeze-dried factor VIII was then made. And Dr. Ritzer's comment is this was an important paper in that it stimulated the change to heat-treated factor VIII and was thought to provide sufficient evidence to warrant the change. He identifies questions left unanswered. So that is what is said to be sufficient to justify a move to heat-treated products. If we go on to page 130, this is a section of Dr. Ritzer's report entitled Response of UK Haemophilia Centre Directors to Appearance of AIDS in Haemophiliacs. And if we go to 131, we can see the entry for November 1982, which refers to a letter that Dr. Krask wrote to Dr. Ritzer. The comment is, by the end of 1982, approximately 5 months after the first report of AIDS in haemophiliacs in USA, all UK Haemophilia Centre directors had been informed of the problem and efforts were being made to obtain up-to-date information and to set up a system of surveillance of haemophiliacs in UK. And so 2 issues that arise from that for your consideration in due course. One is that an accurate description of what had been done by the end of 1982? And was it the appropriate response to what was known by the end of 1982? We then go, please, to page 134. There is a detailed comment by Dr. Ritzer on the decision to continue using imported factor VIII in May 1983. And if we go to the bottom of that page, Dr. Ritzer sets out 3 options. 1, stop using imported concentrate and switch to cryoprecipitate or NHS factor VIII. 2, stop using both imported and NHS concentrate and use cryoprecipitate. 3, stop all treatment with blood products, including cryoprecipitate. So you'll no doubt wish to consider whether there were, in fact, potentially other options or combinations of options. But Dr. Ritzer then sets out his own assessment of the options. He says the last was quite unacceptable. Again, the question that may arise, to whom? As it would have exposed the patient to the risks of prolonged and uncontrolled bleeding, severe pain and crippling, and possibly death. He describes the top of the next page what he says would have been the impact on the quality of life of the patient and family if there had been a cessation of all treatment with blood products. And at the end of that first paragraph says this: I believe that most patients, and in particular the parents of young patients, would have found this unacceptable. Again, so the question that obviously arises is the extent to which any attempt was made to actually elicit the views of patients or the parents of young patients. Option 1, he goes on to say, which was a switch to cryo or NHS factor VIII, was dependent on there being sufficient supplies of the alternative materials. He says that NHS factor VIII was in extremely short supply in 83, and then says this of cryoprecipitate. It had been used less and less since the early 70s when imported concentrate became available. It might have been possible, and with great difficulty, to switch all patients to cryoprecipitate, but cryoprecipitate had several important drawbacks, and then he sets them out: difficult to reconstitute, several packs had to be pooled, great variability in its factor VIII concentrate, allergic reactions commoner than with factor VIII concentrate, unsuitable for home treatment, and patients would therefore need to attend hospital. And then he says as time passed and AIDS spread more widely in the donor population, cryoprecipitate would have become less safe. He then says, in practical terms, the problem of handling large numbers of doses of cryoprecipitate rapidly and safely would have been very great at most haemophilia centres. In 1983, a large centre such as that at Oxford was using approximately 7 million units of factor VIII to treat its haemophilia patients. To provide this as cryoprecipitate would have meant handling approximately 100,000 bags of cryoprecipitate per year, or more than 250 bags per day. This would have been extremely difficult to do. Smaller centres, of course, might have managed. And then he says whether or not blood transfusion centres could have provided the cryoprecipitate is a moot point. Top of the next page. Production of raw plasma would have had to increase 2- to 3-fold. A switch completely to cryoprecipitate would have resulted in the blood transfusion centres not sending plasma to BPL for fractionation, so that development and large-scale production of safe NHS concentrates would have been delayed. And then this, finally and not least, few patients, given the lack of knowledge of AIDS and its implications, were prepared to modify their treatment and life routine to such an extent. So that is a statement by Dr. Ritzer that patients were not, doesn't say would not have been, were not prepared to modify their treatment to the extent of receiving cryoprecipitate rather than concentrate. Thus far, sir, in the evidence the inquiry has received, I don't recall yet evidence from any patient saying that the alternative of switching completely to cryoprecipitate was discussed with them. But that clearly is a matter that will need to be looked at further. And then he goes on to talk about the decision to recommend using NHS factor VIII or cryoprecipitate in children and infrequently transfused or mildly affected patients, if that had been the director's practice, was reasonable at the time. About 8 or 9 lines further down, perhaps a bit further, he says, the decision to continue using imported concentrate was reasonable in view of the perceived balance of risks at that time between the dangers of untreated bleeding and the dangers of contracting AIDS. So that's Dr. Ritzer's reasoning in relation to the decision to continue using commercial concentrates in May 1983. We go to page 140. This is where we've reached now December 1984 and the provision of guidelines by UKHCGO in December of 1984. Just draw your attention to the bottom part of the page where Dr. Ritzer says the recommendations, so that's the AIDS advisory document dated the 14th of December, were sent out shortly after the date on the document, but may well have been delayed by postal problems at Christmas. The document would have been received by the director at the latest during the first week of January 1985. He then has a comment about the recommendation to use heat-treated concentrates. If we go to the next page, about 10 lines down, he says it must be stated that there was a good deal of uncertainty about the safety of heated products in clinical practice. And he talks about the difference of opinion as to the comparative safety of unheated NHS factor VIII and heated American factor VIII. So those are the, I think, perhaps the key passages in Dr. Ritzer's report that I wanted to show you. Clearly the report itself needs to be read in full, and if it turns out to be the case that Dr. Ritzer gives evidence, then no doubt he can be asked further questions about it. So that, I think, effectively concludes today's presentation. We've identified in the written note that has been provided to core participants and legal representatives a number of issues that you may wish to consider in relation to the Oxford Haemophilia Centre once you have all the available evidence, including potentially any statements you receive from clinicians and further statements from patients. And some of the key questions that we have identified that you may wish to consider are as follows. What was the Centre's, and in particular Dr. Ritzer's, state of knowledge about the risks of infection associated with blood products, and how did that knowledge develop over time? Did the Centre, including Dr. Ritzer as its director, underestimate the potential seriousness of non-A, non-B hepatitis, and if so, why? When did the Centre, and in particular Dr. Ritzer as director, first appreciate the risks of developing AIDS in consequence of the use of factor products? What steps did the Centre and Dr. Ritzer as its director take in response to that risk? Were they sufficient? Should more have been done, and if so, what? What influence did Dr. Ritzer have on the actions and decisions of UKHCDO? Should UKHCDO have provided different or earlier advice to centre directors, and if so, what? What information and advice was provided by clinicians at the centre to patients about the risks, benefits and disadvantages of treatment with factor concentrates, the availability, suitability and safety of alternatives, the risks of and seriousness of hepatitis, and the risks of and seriousness of HIV and AIDS? What were the arrangements for testing for HIV and for HCV, and were patients told they were being tested? Was their consent sought? How and when were patients informed of the test results? Was appropriate and adequate information provided to them? How was the care and treatment of those diagnosed with HIV or HCV managed at the centre? And finally, did the centre provide to patients who participated in one or more of the multiple research studies undertaken there sufficient information to enable them to give informed and valid consent? Core participants have also suggested a further issue, and this will arise across the board, not specifically to Oxford, or not to Oxford alone, about the position in relation to suspect batches, particularly in the later part of 1984 and 1985 and early 1985, and what protocols or procedures existed in relation to suspect batches and the recall of batches. So that completes the presentation on Oxford for the week.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Richards. That concludes the work for this week. We are not meeting next week.
No.
So the week after, we begin on the Tuesday, do we?
We begin on the Tuesday, the date of which temporarily escapes me, with the evidence of Professor Christine Lee on the Tuesday and Wednesday, and then the evidence of Professor Edward Tuddenham on the Thursday. And those are witnesses who are giving evidence in person here, and obviously will focus upon the Royal Free Hospital.
Yes. Well, those of you who are coming back, I look forward to seeing you again. Those who are not, may I just hope that you stay safe and take care, and no doubt I will see you in due course. But thank you for your attendance. Thank you, Ms. Richards, and my thanks to those who represent the various core participants who've sat behind you and no doubt downstairs. So, thank you all until a week, or Tuesday week, best way of putting it.